Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our fourth and nth party, What You Need to Know to Effectively Manage Your Extended Third-Party Ecosystem webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials. Answer all 3 of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will send the link to that follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session. If you meet all requirements, we will send your CPE certificate within 5 to 7 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will provide helpful information to assist you in identifying, assessing, and managing fourth and nth party risk. Hillary will also focus on strategies and tools that any organization can use to enhance visibility to their extended third-party ecosystem, mitigate fourth and nth party risk, and explore ways to determine if your third-party vendors are managing their subcontractors appropriately. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our VinMonitor product tours, links to our fourth-party due diligence questions, what to ask for a third-party infographic, our understanding subservice organizations within vendor stock reports infographic, our how to write fourth-party vendor requirements into the contract infographic, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. With all that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jessie. Well, welcome everyone. Today we are talking all about fourth-party vendors. And we're going to start off with just defining who is a fourth-party vendor, into which of these types of vendors need your attention. We're also going to focus a lot today on your third party's responsibility for managing your own vendors and discuss some risk management techniques for managing those fourth and nth parties. We'll wrap up with some regulatory perspectives on that fourth party management and some key takeaways. So let's jump in. Third party risk management is all about managing your vendor relationships, and that includes fourth and nth parties. So the first topic we want to address today is what exactly a fourth party vendor is. So to be clear about this, your vendors outsource just like you do. So they have their own list of third-party relationships. But your vendors' vendors are what we know as fourth parties. So to continue along this theme, just like your own third parties, your vendors' vendors, or your fourth parties can definitely impact your organization. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Those fourth-party vendors also have vendors, and so on and so on. So instead of calling them fifth and sixth party vendors, we're simply going to refer to those extended relationships as nth parties. So when it comes to fourth and nth party relationships, we need to ensure that those extended vendors, especially the ones that are critical and high risk, that may be instrumental in your vendor's ability to provide products and services to you, are reliable and trustworthy. So when it comes to fourth-party risk, I think it's always helpful to have a visual representation. So here's an example of your organization's third-party environment, multiple vendors, different risk ratings, criticality, etc. Now, here's what that broader risk universe looks like. Each of your third parties has their own vendors, and they have their vendors, and so on. So while your immediate zone of direct control is defined here by that purple line, your zone of concern goes way beyond that initial third-party relationship. So I mentioned the zone of control and another zone of concern, but for another visualization, I want you to think about an iceberg. Third-party risks are easy to see and assess relatively, but those fourth-party and nth-party risks below that waterline are much harder to see or assess. But is that really such a big deal? So the short answer is absolutely yes. If we want to ask why, let's just start with cybersecurity. Extended vendors actually expand your attack surface, especially if they access any of your organization or customer data. Regulatory compliance is another really big concern, as is business continuity and resilience. Imagine that your critical vendor depends on their critical vendor to provide products and services to you. If that fourth party goes down, your third party can't operate without them and your organization is impacted. And when the fourth party creates that chain reaction of impacts, guess who might be feeling it financially? That's right, your organization. And finally, your customers don't necessarily care or even understand that issues impacting them were caused by a fourth-party vendor. If they have a negative experience or they have their data breached or something similar, it's your organization that's going to be held responsible. And you can just imagine how that can damage your reputation and your brand. All right, you might be feeling a little overwhelmed thinking about this massive and expansive universe of extended fourth and nth parties. But I'm here to tell you can take a little bit of a breath because we don't really have to worry about every single fourth and nth party. We don't need to worry about most of them, in fact, but where do we need to put our attention? So first of all, think about your critical vendors or any vendor of yours that has access to sensitive data. Now we need to think about the vendors that they rely on or that they may be sharing data with. Those are the vendors that definitely deserve your attention. All right, to share two very quick examples, let's click on the left. These might be your third-party vendors, maybe critical vendors. So the first one is software as a service. Well, they have a vendor that's a hosted data center, which is your fourth party. The data center goes down and prevents the software provider from delivering products and services to you. That's a big deal. In the second example, we have a full-service marketing company. We don't always think about that, but they use a lot of vendors to provide products and services to help support your marketing. One might be an email campaign provider who is subject to very specific regulations, such as the Can-Spam Act and others. If they send out an email with misleading or incorrect information, it is your organization that is going to bear the burden. So while you're thinking about your third parties and fourth parties, let's go to our first poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, does your organization actively identify and monitor fourth parties? Yes, we actively identify and monitor all fourth parties. Yes, we actively identify and monitor all critical and/or high-risk fourth parties. Somewhat, we're in the beginning phases or working on developing a process. No or not sure. Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Okay, great.
Do you have any real-world examples of a fourth-party breach?
I do, actually. So many of you will probably remember last May, there was a big issue with something called MoveIt. So MoveIt was a file transfer tool that, many organizations use. And there was a vulnerability in this tool that was exploited, and thousands of organizations worldwide were breached. Now, what makes this a fourth-party breach for many is that, especially in financial organizations, that Move It tool is being used by their vendors for this file transfer service. So there were so many organizations that were impacted directly by Move It because their individual vendors were using it. So I think in recent history, the Move It breach is probably the best example we have of fourth-party breaches. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you will find our fourth-party due diligence questions, What to Ask Your Third-Party infographic available for download. This handy resource discusses what you need to ask your third party to learn about their fourth party risk. With that, I will hand it back to you, Hillary.
So we all know that third party risk management is challenging enough, but then when it comes to fourth parties and nth parties, we have a whole slew of additional challenges. So without reading all of these, let me summarize this for you. Basically, you don't get to pick who those fourth parties are. You don't have a relationship with them, and they're not trying to maintain your business. You have no legal contract that would incent them to provide information for due diligence or meet a certain performance level. So it's really hard to incent them to do anything. They don't have to. You also really can't perform effective due diligence if they aren't willing to share information. And even if there was a problem, you don't have any incentive to make them fix that problem. You also don't determine what their service levels look like, and you don't have the authority to terminate the relationship. Now, in spite of all those barriers, there are things that we can and should do. And we're going to refer to these as those risk management techniques for fourth parties. We will go through each one in detail. But just as a summary, the first one is disclosure and transparency. Who are those fourth parties? Keeping an inventory and reviewing your third-party risk management practices, right? So how do they manage their vendors? We also are going to ask for evidence of those activities, and we're going to look at our contracts to further incent our third parties to manage their fourth parties. We're also going to think about monitoring and using risk intelligence to help keep our eye on material fourth parties. All right, so let's start at the beginning. The first thing is disclosure and transparency. We need to know who the fourth parties are, and we do that by asking, right? We are going to ask our vendors directly who their fourth parties are. Now, again, we don't want to know about everyone. We really want to limit that scope to anybody who has data or is instrumental in your third party's ability to provide products and services to you. And we should be doing this both at the beginning of the relationship and asking for a refresh. That periodic due diligence is a great time to get an updated list. I also want to point out that stock reporting can be very helpful in validating or helping your vendors disclose those important subservice organizations. So I just want to be clear that a subservice organization is one where their controls in combination with the third party's controls are important to achieving service commitments, meeting system requirements, fulfilling SOC 1 objectives, or addressing SOC 2 trust services criteria. So if they meet any of those, they would be a subservice organization. Now, a SOC report's only going to talk about the subservice organizations that are relevant to the product and service. So don't necessarily mistake subservice organizations for all fourth parties. In most cases, anything that is a subservice organization listed in the SOC report for your vendor should be considered a critical fourth party to you. So as those fourth parties and nth parties are disclosed, you need to build an inventory. And we need to make sure that inventory not only tells us which of your third party relationships they're attached to, but what products and services they're providing to your third party. In that list, we have to be able to sort the list in such a way that we can look for concentration risk. So that's where we have multiple third parties using the same fourth party. And we also want to make sure that this list, this data is, put together in a way that's useful and reportable so that, for example, it could be sorted on different risk dimensions, on different service and product types, etc. All right, we're going to spend a good amount of time today discussing your vendor's third-party risk management practices. So in essence, we really should be including third-party risk management as a separate risk domain through your due diligence process. If you don't have that in place, it's time to develop that process, basically. So to do that, you're going to need to determine which questions you have to ask in that vendor risk questionnaire, what kind of documentation you're going to request as evidence, and who is going to be the subject matter expert reviewing all that information. And for our third-party risk managers, it's probably going to be you. But let's assume that this isn't developed. We're not ready to do that. We still need to take a look at their practices. So how are we going to do that? All right, for a lot of you who have not yet developed this as an additional risk domain in due diligence, we are going to go through what to look at, but I do always want to remind you that using your third-party risk management lifecycle can be such a helpful way to make sure that your reviews are comprehensive, that they're considering all of the risk activities and practices that we need to look at, and that we're considering all the governance that needs to support that program. So that's just a helpful hint is, if you don't know where to start with your life cycle. All right, so one of the very first things off the bat is I want you to think about who is responsible for the third-party risk management function at your vendor. Now, certainly I would ask for their resume and qualifications, and if at all possible, have a brief interview with them. This can take 10 to 15 minutes, and it can tell you a lot. So beyond their initial qualifications, we want to understand if they are familiar with any industry regulations that are governing your industry and your organization. Can they identify key requirements? Can they tell you about the third-party risk management life cycle? Do they understand the required risk identification and assessment activities? Can they talk about their program in general and tell you what the strengths and weaknesses are, or if they're making any significant improvements? This little conversation can tell you so much, and if at all possible, don't skip it. The next absolutely essential component of this review is to look at their third-party risk management policy. If they don't have a policy, or it's really poorly written, that should raise some big red flags. But when we're looking at that policy, we want to think about how consistent it is with best practices and those regulations we talked about. What does their governance and oversight structure look like? Is the board involved? What kind of reporting do they do? Does that policy detail specific roles and responsibilities? And does it cover those basic requirements such as inherent risk assessments, due diligence, contract management, etc.? Just like that third-party risk manager, we want to know about their subject matter experts, because these are the folks that are in charge of reviewing the vendor control environments to make sure they're sufficient. So who at the organization, or maybe they outsource that function, is reviewing vendor due diligence questionnaires and documentation? And are those people qualified? Can they provide evidence of their qualifications? So we also want to think about their issue management process. We need to have this documented, because if they are not actively identifying and documenting and managing issues, that's a bunch of unseen risks that can really cause significant impacts to your organization. So question 1, do they have a documented vendor issue management process? Can you see it? How are issues identified, and who is ultimately responsible for managing and tracking those issues? We also want to know about audits and exams. So independent review is an essential part of effective third-party risk management programs. So let's ask the question, if they've had an audit or exam or some other type of independent review in the last year. And if they haven't, when is the next one scheduled? We'll also want to know what the results were and if there were any issues. And if there were issues, especially related to their third-party risk management program, what were they and what is the remediation status? So we definitely want to know how they identify their critical vendors. So let's ask about that process. Is it documented? Can you see the actual documented criteria for critical? Do they have a list that they're going to share with you? And what percentage of their vendor inventory is considered critical? So just as important as how they identify critical, we want to know their processes and methodology for identifying risk. Now, we want to know that they're performing inherent risk assessments, and hopefully that's happening at the product or service or the engagement level, not just the vendor level. Let's take a look at that questionnaire and see which specific risk domains are identified. We want to make sure that we understand who's responsible for completing that questionnaire, if there's someone who reviews it and approves it, and we want to know what levels of risk they're using. Do they use low, moderate, high, or something else? And how are they using those risk ratings? So we know best practices that we use risk ratings to help us determine that level of management that we're going to need for that vendor, and also to help us inform our due diligence process, how much due diligence, what type of due diligence. And then also we need to understand if they're updating this inherent risk assessment. If so, how often? Because we want to make sure that they're capturing and identifying any new and emerging risks as well. Now, clearly, we are moving through that vendor risk management life cycle, kind of capturing the steps. So the next one would be due diligence. We need to understand how they're vetting their vendors. So first of all, are they performing risk-based due diligence? So the higher the risk, the more extensive that due diligence is. Are they using a vendor risk questionnaire? If so, can you look at it, see what kind of questions they're asking? What kind of basic background checks are they performing? So is that OFAC, or politically exposed persons? Are they looking at financial information using a Dun & Bradstreet? Are they doing a license review, et cetera? And do they have a list of standardized due diligence documents that they ask for from their vendors? And if so, can you see it? We also want to ask a very important question here, if the SMEs that are reviewing this information are required to provide a documented risk review. Very important. And also, is there any stated requirement that due diligence must be completed before they execute a contract? Now, when it comes to contracting, we need to understand if there's any internal requirement that contracts are reviewed by a qualified legal expert before they're signed. And how do they ensure that due diligence is completed before that contract is signed? Now, that's assuming they have the requirement. We hope they do. We also want to know who has the authority to sign a contract with critical or high-risk vendors. So is there any additional oversight that's required when that risk is elevated? And do they have a list of required terms and conditions that they consider in each contract or try and negotiate? So some of the standard ones are breach notification, right to audit, regulatory compliance, cybersecurity, insurance, et cetera. And then how are they tracking and managing their contracts? So do they actively have contract reviews at the midpoint? How much time are they taking before the contract is supposed to renew, to negotiate, et cetera? And then we need to understand what their risk reassessment and due diligence processes look like. So first of all, we want to make sure that they are doing that and how often they're doing that. And if they're doing a risk reassessment and updating their due diligence at the same time, which is more or less the best practice. And if so, can I see a schedule for what is happening when these risk reviews and due diligence is coming up? And are any of the scheduled risk reassessments past due, right? So it's one thing to have a schedule, it's another thing to meet that schedule. And if they're severely behind and things are 6-8 months behind, there's a lot of risk there. So this is a very important thing, is to ask that question about them being past due. And then we also want to, again, ask the question if there's any requirement that a risk reassessment and updated due diligence is completed before any contract renewals. So we also want to think about risk monitoring in addition to those periodic risk reassessments. So do they have an internal requirement to monitor vendor risk? If so, how are they accomplishing that? And if there have been any recent issues. Kind of going hand in hand with that, we have that performance monitoring in management, and we want to know if there's an internal requirement to manage and monitor vendor performance, right? So is vendor performance documented? Do they have a scorecard or something they could show you if you ask? How often is that performance reviewed? Now, if they're following best practices, it's going to be risk-based, with the most critical and high risk being reviewed most often. And is vendor performance monitored against the contract? So if there's SLAs in the contract, is that part of that actual performance review?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization currently review the third-party risk management practices of your critical vendors? Yes, somewhat, no, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here from the audience that we could go ahead and answer.
All right, let's do it.
Great. And this question is, shouldn't we conduct a full vendor risk review on critical fourth parties?
Okay, well, the answer is not really. And I'll tell you why. As we've been discussing throughout the presentation, you as an organization do not have a direct contractual relationship with that fourth party. That's the very nature of being a fourth party, right? So all of the information that we would gather to do those risk reviews, all that due diligence documentation, SOC reports, et cetera, it's incredibly unlikely that someone's just going to hand that over to an organization where they have no direct business relationship. To add some complexity to that, assuming that you discovered an issue, you also have no relationship or contract that's going to obligate them to mitigate those issues. So you would still be bringing your third party back into that situation to try and get some remediation. So what I don't recommend trying to do full risk reviews on your fourth parties. One, because it's impractical from the perspective that you're probably not going to get the right amount of information that you need, and it's also really difficult to mandate remediation. I hope that clears that up.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Back to the related content widget, you will find our Understanding Subservice Organizations Within Vendor SOC Reports infographic. This is a helpful resource to grab as it walks you through how to review your vendor SOC report to identify any subservice organizations, also known as your fourth parties. Hillary, back to you.
Thanks, Jessie. So coming back to the presentation, if you'll remember, before we started talking about third-party risk management practices of your vendors, I said that we're going to need to really think about this or add this in as a risk domain for due diligence. And just like due diligence, it's not enough to get the questions answered from the vendor. We need to see proof of these practices. So we want actual documented proof that they are executing their processes as they say they are. So we want to look for a critical vendor inventory. We want to see actual examples of completed inherent risk assessments for those critical vendors. We want to see, maybe pick two of the critical vendors and say, show me what documents you have on file that you use for due diligence for this particular vendor. We want to see that proof of risk reassessment and due diligence and any evidence of performance, monitoring, and management. We want to look at that contract management schedule. So do they know when these contracts are expiring? And that vendor issue tracking log. We also would and should ask for any documented exceptions. So are there times when they've gone out of their process? If so, what are they, who approved it, et cetera. So as we're reviewing all this information about your vendor's third-party risk management practices, certainly we're going to be looking for different information or validation depending on what it is we're examining. But overall, when you're reviewing your third-party risk management program of your vendor, there's 4 kind of common areas or considerations. The first one is clarity. So is it clear why this process or document or information is being used? So is it something you can pick up and read and interpret without a lot of assistance? The next thing, is it complete? So especially with documentation, we want to make sure that it has all the necessary information to effectively convey its purpose, and it should be comprehensive and include any background information or supporting data and references. So, these are good business documents. We also want to look for consistency, right? We want to know that processes, documents, and information are consistent in both in execution and in management. And timeliness, right? We want to know that things are happening on time, that they have a good sense of time-bound activities, and that they're managing to them. Well, all right, at the end of this review, you've looked at all these processes, these information, you've talked to people, you got to draw a conclusion. And so we have to really ask the big question is, will the third-party vendor risk management process be enough? Is it good enough? What's your confidence level in it? And are any of the fourth parties, are they going to require additional attention or scrutiny from your organization? And then finally, how is all of this information going to be captured and monitored internally? Now, what I mean is you, just like a due diligence review, should have a documented, report about your findings, any concerns or issues, and any specific mitigation plans that are necessary. All right, so what if you've gone through this big review and you find out that your third party doesn't have very good vendor risk management practices, or maybe they don't have any? So ultimately, this can be quite a showstopper because it introduces significant risk to your organization that's really hard to control. So we definitely want to discuss this issue with the vendor. And if they're existing vendors, we want to review their contract with legal to see if their failure to have these processes in place is potentially a breach of the contract. It may not be, so you need to be prepared for that. You also, if it's a prospective vendor, can consider making them carry a lot more insurance because the risk is seriously elevated. Now, again, if it's an existing vendor and they've already brought fourth parties to your door and they don't have good vendor risk management practices, you may need to actually carefully monitor some of your fourth parties. And we'll talk about that a little later. Always report any issues that come up in this area through the right chain of command, whether that's your enterprise risk management team or your risk committee. We just want to make sure that we officially document this as a risk. Now, if it's possible to amend the contract to make them fulfill these obligations, that's certainly worth pursuing. And if not, you might need to consider alternatives, like lessening the amount of business that we give them or start working on a replacement vendor. And then if you have no concessions at all from the vendor, they're not working with you, just don't renew that contract. It is really as severe as that sounds. If they're not managing the risks that can damage you, then whatever they're bringing to the table is likely not worth it. So you've heard me talk a lot about contracts, and that is because contracts with your direct third parties are one of the best tools that you have to manage and mitigate risk that comes with fourth parties. And that's because your contracts, when well written, can turn expectations into legal obligations and force requirement of breach notification, cybersecurity compliance, business continuity, and so much more. So let's get into some of the things that you should include in a contract. All right, so the first things first is always get it in writing. Now, I'm not going to read all the sample language on the following slides just for the sake of time, but to summarize, one of the first things that you need to make sure your contract includes is acknowledgement that the vendor may outsource to other vendors to supply products and services to you, and that they are responsible for the actions and behaviors of those fourth parties, and that you expect them to manage their vendors to the same standard that they're managed by you. All right, so some other contract language that we want something that says they are going to identify us and notify us of fourth parties that are coming in. I've even seen contracts go so far as to say that you have to approve them in writing. That's up to you and your organization, but we definitely want to make sure that if we're asking them to tell us about fourth parties, that we're clear on which fourth parties they need to tell us about. Sometimes that means material fourth parties and giving a clear definition of material. We also want a contract stipulation that they are going to do due diligence before executing a contract with those vendors. And we want to cover what it is we expect them to review. Likewise, we want some contract language that talks about monitoring. So they're required to establish monitoring procedures, and I think it's a really good idea to talk about both risk reassessment and ongoing monitoring. But this next one is really important. It's compliance with the vendor contract. So we want some language in the contract that says that basically your fourth parties or their third parties are held to the same terms and conditions as the primary vendor, so your direct third party. So that means they need to meet the same standards and that there's the same transparency and accountability. We also want to make sure we're really clear about indemnification and liability. This is so important when it comes to fourth parties. And this next one here is something that folks often leave out, but it's really important, is if they're terminating or replacing one of those material fourth parties, they need to inform you while they're doing that and what they're doing to mitigate any interruption or disruption. And then finally, always put audit rights in there. That right to audit means the vendor has to cooperate, and so do their fourth parties. Now, that's a lot to think about, so we're going to take our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our third and final poll question is, how does your organization monitor fourth party risk? We depend on the third party to actively monitor fourth party risk. We utilize professional risk intelligence, A and B. Other, we don't monitor fourth party risk or not sure. Hillary, we can go ahead and answer one more question from the audience.
Great.
And this question is, would it be risky to review some fourth parties but not all? It seems like it could lead to more scrutiny and questions as to why only certain parties were reviewed.
You know, where I understand why you might feel that way, it's always important to remember that third-party risk management as a best practice is risk-based, right? So your regulators and auditors will understand that concept. And along with that, it means that you're going to, look at the fourth parties that present the most risk to your organization. And like we said earlier in the presentation, we can't be worried about everyone. There's just too many out there, and then that chain goes on and on. So to be effective in our day-to-day jobs and make sure that we are given ourselves enough bandwidth and leeway to run our direct third parties, we need to be selective about who we are choosing to monitor. So no, don't be concerned that your auditors or examiners are going to call you out for not reviewing every single one, but you should always be able to articulate your decision for the ones that you are monitoring. Why are you monitoring them versus somebody else? I hope that helps.
And here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for answering this question. Before we continue, I would like to mention that we have our How to Write Fourth-Party Vendor Requirements into the Contract infographic available for download in the Related Content widget. As we've discussed leveraging your third-party contracts to mitigate your fourth-party risk, this is a handy resource to grab. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
Now, I want to talk about some more challenges you might come across in this fourth-party management space and what we can do about it. And the first one is you really aren't comfortable that your third party is managing fourth parties sufficiently and they are really not monitoring them. So the first thing we want to do is we want to document the risk and the potential impacts if that fourth party fails or has some sort of incident. Then I really highly recommend this. Monitor using professional risk intelligence services. Now, we've been talking about this a lot. It's very popular nowadays, but if you are unaware, risk intelligence services are professional organizations that gather and analyze information from various external sources, right? They can look at things like cybersecurity posture, financial health, reputation, regulatory compliance, OFAC, et cetera. Now, the good thing about risk management, risk intelligence services rather, is you don't need a contract to monitor a company. You can literally monitor everything you want, and that's because a lot of these sources are public. It's that risk intelligence service that's putting together all the information, pulling it, and analyzing it. So for those really tricky fourth parties, risk intelligence can be just an invaluable tool. Now, in another situation, let's say that you have discovered some of that concentration risk. You have multiple third parties using the same fourth party. First thing we want to do is document the risk and the potential impacts. This is kind of a standard thing we need to do. One, because it shows transparency and gives visibility to our management, the board, or risk committee that this is going on. And then when it's appropriate, we may need to ask for a formal risk acceptance, which is another formal documentation of the risk, the potential impacts, and it records your management or the board's decision whether to accept that risk or to pursue other mitigation. Alternatively, we can think about who else we could use and start working on that plan, but we should be monitoring negative news and, if necessary, look at the fourth party using risk intelligence. Now, this happens all the time with existing contracts. You might have a third party who is not allowed by the conditions of their contracts to share any information about that fourth party with your organization. So if this is the case, we can consider trying to implement what is a multi-party non-disclosure agreement, which means the fourth party and the third party will sign the agreement with you. Everyone's bound to the appropriate, disclosure and use of that information. And a lot of times you can do a lot with these multi-party NDAs because it gives that fourth party some sort of assurance that you're not misusing or abusing the information that they're sharing. We can alternatively ask for really redacted information so that we're not getting sensitive details, but that we can analyze maybe the process overall. And then if nothing else, you'll need to ask your third party to attest in writing to the risk management practices and controls, and you're going to need to be very specific about what those are. Attestments are not the same as a contractual obligation, and they can vary in their enforceability in a court of law, but sometimes they're just better than nothing. All right, maybe you have become aware through your monitoring and risk intelligence that there is a reputational issue or some other issue like a regulatory action or a merger, acquisition, something that is concerning to you and your organization about this fourth party. So the first thing you need to do is contact your third party. You want to ask them about their understanding of the situation, and you're going to ask them for a written response. Put it in writing. What is your understanding? What are you doing about it? What's the timeliness of this mitigation plan, et cetera? And then you're also going to ask for a formal follow-up to that mitigation plan, and you're going to tell them when you want that follow-up by. Again, when it's appropriate, it may not be in every circumstance, but you will need to inform your senior management and risk committee, potentially the board if it's very serious about this particular issue. And then you're going to want to continue to monitor the situation on your side, looking at the news and then using that formal risk intelligence or those risk alerts and monitoring services. So as we've gone through all this information today, I do want to come back to sort of the regulatory expectations around fourth parties. And it's really interesting that when you go through the leading regulations on third-party risk management in the U.S., it's really difficult to find explicit mentions of fourth parties. But all of these regulations do emphasize the importance of managing risk throughout the extended enterprise. So organizations can do this and proactively address and manage fourth-party risk by having strong third-party risk management programs themselves and obligating their vendors to do the same. So at a minimum, if you can do nothing else, work with your third parties to identify those material fourth parties or those critical subcontractors, understand what kinds of products and services they support. And then if you can contractually obligate your vendor to provide evidence of their vendor risk management processes. If they don't have any, maybe obligate them to get some, and then periodically audit what it is that they're doing to make sure that there is some sort of sufficient governance and oversight, management and monitoring of these fourth parties. Okay, so we've covered a lot today, but really when you're thinking about your strategies, here you can break this up into 4 main points. One is educating and informing your vendors on what you expect for third-party risk management, enforcing it through the contract, reviewing third-party risk management as a separate risk domain, and narrowing your focus to those most material or critical and high-risk fourth parties. So just to wrap up what we've learned today, here are our key takeaways. So the very first thing is we want to set those expectations with our vendors up front before we sign that contract, and we want to turn those expectations into legal obligations through the contract. We want our vendors to disclose their relevant fourth parties, not just at the beginning of the relationship, but periodically or as they change. And we should be implementing third-party risk management as another risk domain as part of our regular due diligence. And along with due diligence, we need documented evidence of their third-party risk management processes and outputs. We also, if we're having material issues regarding fourth parties, we need to document them and report them through the right risk channel in your organization, whether that's through enterprise risk management or risk committee. And finally, for those really significant fourth parties, maybe there's a lot of concentration risk or some other issue, you will need to do your best to monitor them, and using risk alert monitoring services or risk intelligence is an excellent way to do that. So thank you everyone for your time today. I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for some Q&A. Jessie?
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On March 19th, our How to Review Your Vendor's Financial Health, a walkthrough of financial documents webinar. And on April 2nd, our third-party risk management lifecycle, managing vendor risk from start to finish webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, what can or do you review if your third party refuses to provide their vendor list or third-party risk management practices?
Yeah, that is a real problem, and it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. So when you're dealing with a third party who's just stonewalling, they're not going to give you anything, the very first thing I would do is sit down and review the contract with my legal team and to see if there's anything in there like a right to audit clause that we might be able to leverage to get them to move the dial. Assuming that there is nothing, maybe that contract is not written to give you those privileges. My best advice here would be to try and do your own monitoring. It is very difficult to know who those fourth parties are if they don't tell you. And I would actually treat that as a very risky situation and start working on replacing them or terminating them or getting them to sign a contract where they agree to share that information, because that is a lot of unknown risk to just accept blindly. And I'd really like to encourage everyone to do everything in their power to really reduce or eliminate the amount of relationships you have like that. I hope that helps.
Great. And our next question. Would a high percentage of critical vendors in inventory be a concern? And is there an ideal percentage range?
That's a really great question. You know, we do get similar questions from time to time about how many critical is too many. And there is generally a rule of thumb that is about no more than 15% of their total inventory would be critical. Now, that doesn't apply in every case, but the reason for that is when there's too many critical vendors, it can mean one of two things. One, their criteria that they use to identify those critical vendors is not very precise, and so therefore too many are getting in the mix, and that might mean that that's diluting the attention that's necessary. On the other hand, they could literally outsource everything and be very dependent on a lot of vendors. So just because they're not hitting that percentage doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong, but it would prompt me to follow up with what is your criteria for determining critical and what products and services do these vendors provide. I hope that's useful.
Great. Our next question. Aren't those vendor documents confidential? My understanding is my vendor cannot share their vendor's information because it is all governed by an NDA.
That is true in most cases. And to be fair to the fourth parties, I mean, if you think about yourself in those terms, you know, I'm working with someone and they want to work with someone else, and so they're just going to share my information where I don't have a relationship with that other party. So multi-party NDAs can be a way to get around that, where your vendor works directly with that third party to express that they're going to share specific documentation with you. You sign that NDA as well. And that helps those fourth parties get a better sense of confidence and about how their sensitive data, you know, and information is going to be accessed and reviewed. But, you know, they are within their rights not to share that information. So if you run up against that, you're going to have to, again, put the pressure on your third party and really know what it is they're doing to manage their vendors.
Great. Our next question is, If one of the fourth parties is also one of your third parties, can you leverage your third-party risk management process?
That does happen all the time. So you can. I mean, you can certainly look at, let's say you're using AWS and your vendor is also using AWS. You might have a lot of information about that particular vendor, maybe their cybersecurity practices, something similar. But keep in mind that we need to understand the risks as they pertain to the exact product and service the vendor is providing. So if it's kind of an apples to apples, all right, that's great. But the missing component there is not just what the fourth party is doing in terms of their, information security protection, et cetera, but how are they being managed by your third party? So that's kind of the missing element. But certainly, I always say you've got to be really creative and flexible in third-party risk management. And sometimes you're not going to have all the answers. If you have that, it's certainly okay to look, but do not assume that everything is going to apply to their relationship with your third party as it does to you.
Okay, great. Next question. What options do you have if your vendor is much larger and there is no alternative and they are not managing nth-party risk well?
Again, we all have those examples sometimes of the giant vendor. Maybe they're, the only one in the region or the only one providing that specific product and service, and therefore our hands get a little bit tied. So, of course, I would default to some of the information that we've shared, but just a few things that can be useful. One is asking for a written attestation of their risk management practices and controls. You can work with your legal team to kind of shore that up as much as possible from a legal perspective. Now, again, that's just them putting it in writing that, yes, we have those things. It's not a great substitute for seeing it in person. The second technique I would do is certainly look at your contract before any renewals, see if you can negotiate it, because ultimately these days most organizations are understanding that they need to have some level of third-party risk management. For someone who doesn't, or they refuse to share what those practices are, that should be a red flag and kind of an unmeasured risk that you need to pay attention to.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. Is it acceptable to only monitor fourth parties for our higher inherent risk vendors, such as not monitor fourth parties for low inherent risk?
Oh, absolutely. So one thing to make sure that everyone's clear on is we cannot be worried about all the fourth parties. We need to think about who is most essential to our operations, right? What products and services that we need to keep our doors open, to stay in regulatory compliance, et cetera. And we need to think about those vendors who are providing those products and services and who is instrumental to them being able to provide those critical products and services. We don't care who mows the vendor's lawn or necessarily takes out their trash or, cleans their, we just don't care. But we need to really think about if a fourth party is providing an essential service or product that makes it possible for me and my organization to get a critical product or service, they should be on my radar.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thanks again, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another big thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to fourth-party risk management. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of Minder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.